comic books,
comics,
comic book podcast.
We like
Comic books.
because they have no clothes.
I'm Joe Guetschow,
And I'm Mike White.
and this is We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones.
And as always, you can find us on social media. Check out all the links. Anchor.fm/Boneless Comics Podcast for the website. On Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, we are at Boneless Comics Podcast. And on Twitter at Boneless Comics 1. And again, the YouTube channel is just there as kind of a little bit of extra content that you guys can check out. We're doing an after show, which is mainly things that were in our notes or maybe just kind of interesting asides that we had that didn't really fit into the review proper. So if you guys go check that out on YouTube, that would be much appreciated. I think it's, some pretty enjoyable stuff.
Yeah.
But what we are talking about today is Edge of Spider-Verse, number 1 through 5, which is collected in a trade paperback. But Joe, would you like to go ahead and tell us who the creators are?
Yeah, so Edge of Spider-Verse 1 through 5, written by David Hine, Fabrice Sapolsky, Jason Latour, Dustin Weaver, Clay McLeod Chapman, and Gerard Way, and illustrated by Richard Isanove, Robbie Rodriguez, Dustin Weaver again, Elia Bonetti, and Jake Wyatt. And I really apologize if I butchered any of those names, but there you have it.
I think you did pretty okay. One thing I wanted to bring up, though, is that list is uniquely a list of creators that besides Richard Isanove and Gerard Way, I don't think I've ever encountered in comics before. And that's going to be a trend with this episode because we are way outside my normal reading wheelhouse today. So this is going to be very much a reversal of what we normally have where I've been like, oh yeah, I know all these guys. Joe, this is going to be kind of your show because you are much more familiar with Marvel and particularly the kind of extended universe of Spider-Man. So speaking of that, these are all what could be termed tie-in issues or prequel issues to an event comic. So just to give everybody kind of a quick rundown, the closest thing we've ever seen to an event comic in movies or other media to kind of relate it to something a little more mainstream would be Avengers End Game, where you really have all the characters from the various superhero franchises coming together for one big story event. And that's something that happens in comics. I think really the 1980s is when it became big with like Crisis on Infinite Earths at DC. And then Marvel's first really big one was Secret Wars. And it's been something that both companies have done to drive sales, but also to kind of make their universe feel a little bit more unified, to bring all their characters together for a big event. So those stories are typically not completely self-contained, though. So there are tie-in issues, which are what's going on in Green Arrow's title or what's going on in Daredevil's title while there's a Spider-Man event going on, or and so these are all one-shots or kind of one-off issues that each introduce a character that's relevant to the Spider-Verse event.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because this is not just a tie-in, but also to sort of get you acquainted with some of the characters and also at the same time create some new characters just to have some sort of, I don't know, you'd almost call them guest writers, people that have never, really done much with Spider-Man, but they kind of bring their unique take to the set of, I don't know, spider parameters, I guess you could say, to create a character and a backstory that you'll find in a couple of these issues. So it's, even though there's only 5 of them, they're very different. They're written by different people. They're different stories, different characters. It's all a different take on that Spider-Man theme as far as what this is tying into.
Well, I did want to add, I guess, really briefly that when there is an event comic, typically there is one writer that is kind of the curator of what's going on, that's writing the event book proper. And so in this case, that would be Dan Slott. And so his role is to write the primary story that everyone else is kind of riffing on in their standalone titles. But he almost would serve as somewhat of an editorial role as well, where it would be like, okay, this is the narrative that we're setting out to tell. And so you other writers here, these are kind of the parameters that you need to work within. And just to my way of thinking, an incredibly hard position to be in, to be managing just tons and tons of books that are coming out simultaneously every month, trying to keep them consistent, all that stuff. I would not want that job. But at least from what I've read of Spider-Verse, it does feel like it's all interconnected and related to the Spider-Man universe. And again, these are just unique takes on the Spider-Man mythology that take place on alternate Earths. And then after the series that we're reviewing, they would then come together in the event book where you would see all these guys interacting. So
Yeah. This mini series is basically like a prequel to the Spider-Verse event, which basically is a multiversal Spider-Man event where there's a Spider-Man in every universe and they all come together for a common enemy. So to really understand this, we have to go back in time in our spider capsules to 2001, where a writer by the name of J. Michael Straczynski, who is hugely famous for his sci-fi show called Babylon 5, and John Romita Jr., who has penciled, well, just a lot.
yeah, if you've read a comic book in the last 30 years, you have seen John Romita Jr.'s art somewhere. I mean, he's
Yes.
very prolific.
So in 2001, JMS came up with the concept of the spider totem as a mystical origin of Spider-Man's powers. So this opened us up to more mystique around the accident that turned Peter Parker into Spider-Man. So this also introduced us to something called the Web of Life, which is spun by a totemic spider deity called the Great Weaver, though several totemic spider deities exist and are responsible for maintaining different aspects of the web. It was created actually by Kwaku Anansi, I think I'm saying that correctly, who is an extra dimensional being worshipped as the African spider god, but he was also the first Spider-Man in existence. So in 2001, a lot of lore was introduced to explain on a grander scale how Spider-Man came to be Spider-Man.
The Spider-Man cartoon in the 90s had a character called Madam Web that seemed to be kind of a mystical, existing out of time character that was guiding Spider-Man towards his destiny. And I don't know if she exists in the comic books at all, but
She does.
oh, she does. Okay, I was going to say this concept sort of reminds me of that, although they take a hard left turn and take it in a way different direction, than that show does.
Yeah, there's been a lot of little things here and there that have alluded to the fact that there could be Spider-Men from different universes that either come together to fight or to fight for a common goal. In that animated series, they were testing to find out who the strongest one was from which universe, because Spider Carnage was on the rampage trying to destroy the multiverse. But that's a whole nother different story. But anyway, so the Web of Life in this context is kind of like the Speed Force, but it's on a multiversal scale. It's where all spider people ultimately derive their spider powers, and it connects these spider people from different universes together as totemic entities. So it also has similarities to the Green Lantern rings, where it decides who becomes a spider powered being in that universe. And it takes it a step further by manipulating events to lead them to actually acquire their powers. So this is a very powerful linking agent between all of the spider people across the multiverse. And it sets up the origin of Spider-Man to be more like predestination rather than like a random accident. So along with all of that, we got introduced to a character named Morlan, who is bent on killing Spider-Man. And that's really a broad statement because there's a lot of people who want a piece of Spider-Man, since he has one of the, if not the largest rogues galleries, I think, out there.
Yeah, it's at Marvel certainly, and within comics, I think the only person that's close or surpasses him is Batman. So yeah, he's got a huge rogues gallery.
So fast forward to 2014 in September. This is where Dan Slott has taken over, and we discover that Morlan's mysterious past. He is from a universe designated Earth 001, and we learn about his estranged family known as the Inheritors. They are basically like a family of vampires who feed on the life forces of all the spider people. So you have JMS, who set up these totem entities, and now you have Dan Slott taking that, running with it, and saying Morlan and his family feed on that power, that specific power. So they hijack the web of life and they scour the universe to find these spider people to feed off of their powers. And so then that brings us into the actual Spider-Verse event, which lasted from November 2014 to February 2015. It inspired future comics. There are probably around, I don't know, quick count, 100 or more alternate reality incarnations of Spider-Man. A lot of them came from this, but some of them were featured prior to this event as well. So this was neat to pull some of those other characters that had been created separately as alternate takes and actually bring them into an event to have a reason to have them meet our Peter Parker, although at the time he was Doc Ock as the Superior Spider-Man, but that's another tangent for another time. Well, so maybe we should kick this off and talk about Spider-Man Noir.
Yeah, so Spider-Man Noir, I'm just going to spoil it right now. This actually was my favorite of the 5 issues in this collection. From my understanding, there was a miniseries that had featured this character prior to this one shot. So he had some kind of an established universe already set up. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
I know he had a mini. I just didn't know if it was after or before this.
yeah. The character actually, his first appearance was in 2009.
Oh, so it had been a while then.
Yep.
This one was just Richard Isanove did the art, and it didn't wow me, but the colorist put it into that noir crime drama, kind of late 1930s, early 40s, sort of a time between the 2 world wars era. I think the art really sold that tone well, and it fit, even though it was kind of like a stock comic booky style with coloring that, you know, gave it that gritty atmosphere, but I liked it. I felt like this, to me, was the most successful of these experiments if I'm just basing it on the one shot. So Peter is bitten by a spider that was housed in like a spider god idol. So it wasn't exactly clear to me whether or not there was something magical about it in nature or if that's just where it happened to be hanging out. But I felt like bringing those elements in fit with the genre that they were doing here.
Yeah, it really fits with the whole predestination and that whole web of life, as far as, you know, more than just a random accident, because he actually has a dream about a spider god who claims it's going to give him this power. So he actually has this little vision as well about that. So it's definitely more than just, hey, a spider bit me. I'm not sure where it came from, but look what I can do. There's a little more to it.
Right. Well, and they grounded it to real world events, because I think they mentioned that he helped bust Al Capone and, you know, some other gangsters during the Prohibition era of America. When this story opens, we're just leaving Prohibition, because they kind of make a note of that. And they're questioning the relevancy of Spider-Man. Do we need this vigilante out there stopping bad guys in a fedora and a dark jacket like we did, you know, during the Prohibition era? Yeah, if I didn't mention that, he basically dresses like a turn of the century detective with a Spider-Man mask on, but it's all black. He's kind of like the hard-boiled detective version of Spider-Man, and Spider-Man fights Mysterio in this, which, if you guys don't know, showed up in Spider-Man Far From Home, which is his most recent movie. This is a little bit different take on him that fits with the time period a little bit more, because he has some sort of alchemical mixture or some sort of mist that he uses to cause hallucinations to make people think he's doing these incredible feats, instead of it being, you know, special effects wizardry and technology, which is what you would see in kind of the mainline Spider-Man comics. So I thought that was a cool way to take his gimmick, which is being this flim-flam man and taking people for their money, and transplanting it into the time period where Spider-Man Noir is set.
Yeah, I think this character, maybe aside from Spider-Gwen, is so popular partly just because it really works. Like everything together, the time period, the art, being able to use those characters and sort of redesign their gimmicks to fit within that time period. It just, I don't know, it just all comes together. And especially when you have people like Nicolas Cage, do the voice acting, who's got that stoic voice, or even Milo Ventimiglia. Like, they really add that personality to the character. And so it's fun to see this character on screen as well as in print. Like, it just works well together.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel like if you were in an editorial pitch meeting at Marvel and somebody was like, "Hey, I want to do a Spider-Man story that's a crime drama in the 1930s, and he's like a hard-boiled detective that carries a gun," they would be like,
Oh, heck no.
"What are you smoking?" But in practice, it works so well.
Yeah.
In fact, as far as just taking the Spider-Man concept and putting it into a different genre, I think this is, again, spoilers for the end, but this was my favorite of the 5 issues. I just felt like everything was working and it felt well thought out, and like it was, I don't know, it was just a good idea, well implemented. So they brought the Kingpin in as well, which, again, it makes so much sense. He's basically the gangster in the Marvel universe. So of course he would be fighting against Spider-Man in this crime genre.
Yeah. Another character that you can transplant from current continuity into this time period, and it works really well. You have a Kingpin of Crime. Well, that's really what these stories are about, is all these crime syndicates and secret meetings of mafia bosses and things like that. And the Kingpin fits in perfectly with that.
Yeah, he really didn't even need to be changed at all to feel like he made sense in this story. So again, I thought that one did really well. There are a lot of kind of dark shadows done with the inks and things like that to give it that noir feel, but they did a lot of bright colors on the backgrounds, and the color palette wasn't as limited as maybe what I would have expected. So yeah.
Well, in the next issue, we have Spider-Woman, who is also called Spider-Gwen, or commonly known as Gwen Stacy. So in her multiverse, she is called Spider-Woman because she's the only one. But because there is at least one other Spider-Woman in Marvel continuity, they dubbed her Spider-Gwen so that way we could set her apart from the other Spider-Woman or Spider-Women.
Well, I mean, the name of her comic is Spider-Gwen.
Right.
But in her universe, she's Spider-Woman. That's the best DC example I can think of. That is, for years, the name of a comic was Shazam, but the name of the character was actually Captain Marvel. Now, when they rebooted, they were like, he's just Shazam, because everybody was calling him that anyway, since it was the name of his book. But it doesn't really make sense for people to call Gwen Stacy Spider-Gwen, because that means they're just saying her secret identity.
Right.
So.
But yes, actually about Spider-Gwen, this is her first appearance. So it sets the tone for what her solo book or solo issues are going to be like, with the art style and her being a member of the Mary Janes and her trying to, just as the spider people do, trying to have a life and then finding out that it's really hard to do because you have to keep a secret identity and you have to constantly run off and make excuses for why you're going out to fight crime when, obviously people can't know about that. And like you said, with Spider-Man Noir, it's got that baggage. But in this case, she's mimicking the earlier Peter Parker stuff where he's trying to figure out how to make it in the world and how to deal with all of these events and the drama of what's going on, as well as preserving a secret identity and being a secret superhero. But it's more complicated for her because her father is the chief of police.
Yeah, so that little story beat reminded me a lot of Barbara Gordon for obvious reasons, because, Batgirl is the daughter of Commissioner Gordon at Batman. So I kind of linked that up and thought, oh yeah, that's a dynamic that works really well as far as confusing the line between vigilante and police work, and am I doing the right thing, and all that sort of stuff is baked into her concept. I did want to mention, though, that while they are kind of visiting those early story beats that Peter Parker went through as Spider-Man, Gwen Stacy feels like a much more empowered character and like somebody that knows who she is and what she wants a lot more than Peter did in the early days.
Yeah.
She's certainly a lot hipper than Peter was.
That's for sure. Well, and she's not necessarily into fashion, I guess, but she's a really rockin' drummer. So I guess that I don't know, but her friends are into fashion, I suppose. So that's sort of what helps. But I think the visual art style really lends to that as well. But yeah, she doesn't struggle with, oh, am I doing the right thing? Because I'm a vigilante. That's her father, who's in this. Actually, they do it right off the bat where she reveals her secret identity to him. So he walks that fine line of, okay, I'm the chief of police and we're hunting this vigilante, but I can't hunt her because she's my daughter. I need to protect her. But at the same
Right.
time, we can't just allow these vigilantes to go around and do what they want. So he's got that conflict of what he wants to do about this information that he receives. And they flesh this out more in her solo title, where he goes more the protective instinct, but also, wants her to be careful. And then it opens them up to more issues as far as having to protect each other when other people learn her identity. But that's later stories.
Yeah, and what they do with Peter Parker in this universe is drastically well, not only is it drastically different, but it's really dark.
Yeah.
I was very surprised that I think I vaguely remember a story beat of her saying that her Peter was dead in the Spider-Verse movie, but I didn't track the exact circumstances of it. I don't know if that's even mentioned there, but this comic goes into a lot more detail about how that happened. And it was really, he was kind of jealous of the fact that Gwen had these spider powers. And he thought, well, I'm not special. She's not going to stay with somebody like me. And so Peter, being sort of the intelligent scientist character that he is from the comic books, he creates a formula that turns him into a lizard, which is that's a reference to a Spider-Man villain of the lizard. But in Spider-Woman or Spider-Gwen's continuity, Peter himself becomes the lizard, and he actually is killed while going on a rampage that Gwen has to stop. So that's a pretty, I mean, Gwen Stacy dies in the mainline Spider-Man comic books, and it is in a way where Spider-Man was actively trying to save her. And you could maybe argue that his actions inadvertently, but still did result in her death. In that, he throws out the web, he tries to grab her, and then the sort of the whiplash of the web grabbing her while she's falling breaks her neck. This here is at least as tragic as that. So they're really adding some pathos to her backstory. Is her mother in the picture? That was actually a question that I had that I don't remember if they addressed it at all.
I think that she had passed previously, but I don't remember what the circumstances were.
Okay. And it's very keeping with Spider-Man mythology to be like, the parents are dead, we never talk about it.
Yeah.
That's because that's how Spider-Man comics were for a very, very long time.
So part of the tragedy of this story is really in the main continuity. When Peter tried to save Gwen, he was trying to protect her from a villain that was after him. In this case, he almost made himself into a villain, not on purpose, but he dies in her arms and the police catch up with him and she flees. And so now everybody, and of course by everybody I mean J. Jonah Jameson, is convinced that she is a menace and she is the one who murdered Peter Parker, which sets up her series.
This book, it did a really good job of establishing her backstory. I felt like it was not as good of a self-contained story as the Spider-Man Noir, though. And I think maybe that's because I don't know if there was always a thought of, we're going to give this Spider-Gwen character an ongoing series or what that was. But like some of her supporting cast, like her other band members in the Mary Janes. Oh yeah, that's the name of her band, is the Mary Janes. They fell a little flat for me. I just felt like I was like, well, I kind of want to care about who these people are, but they don't really give me anything to go on except that they're in the band with her. Her father and some of the other supporting cast just didn't have a lot of page time. And I think, honestly, I don't necessarily fault the writer for that. I think it's just a function of, this is one issue. And so they really had to get through her story beats quickly and explain who she is. And there was a lot of narrative there to cross over. So I like the character. And I like the world that they're setting up. I was just wanting, I feel like, a little bit more depth of explanation into some of that stuff. And again, I don't know if that's a fair criticism because, again, it is one issue. So you got 24 pages to get that out. But the art itself as well, while I felt like it fit, and while I'm going to go ahead and go on record saying this, Spider-Gwen has one of the, if not the best designed costumes in like the last 10 years in comics. I mean, she, like the white hoodie and the pink around the eyes and the way the pattern is and everything, and the way she, even though down to like the design of like her footwear and everything, it works. It looks great. It looks athletic. You believe that she could do all this stuff in it. And it's very, very iconic. That being said, this particular penciler went so cartoony with it that it took me out of it just a little bit. And I am a fan of stylized art. I mean, I obviously love, like, you know, the Bruce Timm era of DC animation, and there are some other kind of simplistic art styles out there that I really enjoyed. This one just didn't connect with me for whatever reason. So yeah, I don't know.
Very interesting, you know, different takes on it. I think me coming into this, reading it now, you know, I've read it before, and then I've also read a lot of the Spider-Gwen comics and Spider-Verse. So to me, this is more like just going back in time and being like, oh, this is a neat little teaser for Spider-Gwen to just get you hooked, and that way you'll read the rest of it. But to view it as sort of a self-contained story is hard, kind of like you said, because it's just one issue. You only have so many pages to tell a story, but maybe the story that they told could have been a little more cohesive or just introduce you to more. It's kind of like you picked up something sort of midstream and you peeked into it a little bit, saw what was going on, and then that was it. And you're just left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, that was how I felt as an outside reader, not having as much background reading on her coming into this. But I will say that while I had questions at the end, they were questions of like, oh, well, I would be interested to read her solo title now because I do want to know more about the character. It left me kind of going, oh yeah, I would like to get some of these questions answered. So I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, but you know, for the purposes of what we're doing right now, all I've read is this one issue. So that's all I have to go on, really.
Well, and this story actually briefly features one of her prominent villains by the name of Matt Murdock, who is a very corrupt lawyer in this universe.
I mean, it's been a week since I've read this, but maybe I just completely missed that. But that's crazy that he would be evil in this universe. For everybody that doesn't know, Matt Murdock is Daredevil in our mainline continuity. So that is quite a twist.
Yeah, he is very much a villain, main antagonist. He does a lot to really make things difficult for Spider-Gwen. He's actually in this issue, I think he's at the table with Alexi at one point, the like bluish big brute that she fights at the end and reveals her identity to her dad. They're sitting at the table very briefly. He's got the like red shades on, and he's having a little conversation with him about going to kill her. And so Matt's working for the Kingpin, who is Wilson Fisk, at least at this point. So he's more of, I guess, on the payroll as a lackey.
Yeah, I somehow completely missed that. That's a really cool reversal of the role, though. And I think that's a good direction to take the story in her solo series. So again, I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy it. It was one of those where I feel like I don't have all the information and, would be interested to know more.
Well, if you want to know more, read the Spider-Gwen series and you can find out. But as for us, we are going to continue to issue number 3 in the Edge of Spider-Verse, which is about Spider-Man. Of course, a lot of these are about Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, but this one is called Dr. Aaron Eichman. So he does not have a Peter Parker name or a name that's really appeared in anything Spider-Man related before. And this is also his first and only appearance. So this is a one-off character just for this miniseries.
Mm-hmm. It's weird, Dr. Aaron Eichman as a name, because I realized that they're continuing with that alliterative theme that Stan Lee was known for, not just with naming, but just his general writing style. He loved alliteration. So I do get that they're doing that, but it was really strange that they didn't go with some kind of variant of Peter Parker's name, because I think almost all of the other characters, maybe with the exception of the horror one, have some sort of mixed up or international version of the name Peter Parker. So that was just kind of odd to me.
Yeah, his was close, but I actually have a list here of the most notable ones that I could pull. There's a couple. So there's Petra Parker, and I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong, but I'm going to go with it. He is actually has the same background as our Peter Parker in traditional Spider-Man, but the story takes place in India, created in 2004. So this was sort of like an India retelling of this character making their own version for their nationality. And he actually does get roped into the Spider-Verse event. And he's actually the one that kind of points out that, like, we're not just a multiverse of different characters. We're actually all variations of you, mainline story Peter Parker.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So is the Peter Parker from the primary Marvel universe considered patient zero? And the other characters are kind of aware of that, where they're like, we know that you're sort of the vanilla version and we're the knockoff, or does that come up at all?
That's kind of what he's alluding to. That's really the only place it comes up. But they, like, as people start to get assembled, he kind of notices that, because we have Peter Parkwa, which I'm, again, hope that I'm saying correctly, but he's another version from...
Yeah, he's from Marvel 1602.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there is also Peter Porker, which people are probably familiar with, Spider Ham, which is basically Spider-Man as a cartoon pig. We have Patton Parnell, who's next in our list of issues to discuss. We have Petra Parker, who I think is the actual official female version of Spider-Man. And then there's some other interesting variations that are not related to Spider-Verse. One is actually from 1988 called Peter Pooper, also known as Spidey Man, which is a whole nother story. And then there is, I'm not even sure how you're supposed to say it, but it's like Cedar Sarker or Pasiter Pasarker, but there's this extra S in there. But he is an alien from another planet in the Milky Way galaxy. He was created, or at least appeared, in 2007. And so he's basically Peter Parker, but he looks like the sort of traditional, green, weird alien that you see in media. But he's Spider-Man.
That's yeah, there's a lot. I mean, the cool thing about this concept of a whole multiverse of Spider-Man is that, especially with comic books, the sky's the limit. There's no production budget that you need to get from a movie studio. There's none of that. You just have to have an artist draw it on a page, and boom, you've got another version of Spider-Man. And, obviously, and a good writer behind it too. But it is really cool that there were so many variations created for this event. And Aaron Eichman in particular is very interesting to me, because his story felt a little bit forgettable to me, but the art was really, really interesting, in that it was kind of a fusion of Western and Eastern styles, where it was clearly influenced by Japanese manga, and in particular Masamune Shirao, who's the artist and writer behind Appleseed, which is that was made into an animated movie like several years ago. His work does really, really detailed sort of mecha designs with lots of tubes going into things, and just a level of detail that's completely unnecessary for storytelling, but you can tell that the artist is just enjoying it. That was the look of the art in this story, and that's what it reminded me of. So it was very interesting to look at this story just as kind of an exercise in, like, wow, they really went with a different art style here. It's a very, I don't know, just kind of an odd tale. Like, he injects himself with spider DNA, and I'm not really sure why he does that. But I mean, is that explained at all, or he just goes, well, I was a researcher and I injected myself with spider DNA? I mean, I think that's all there is.
So since this is really his only appearance, in the story, right? So he's trying to cure this, I don't know, his ex-wife or somebody's daughter who
Yeah, Kaori is her
yeah.
name.
So I think he's trying to come up with a way to cure her or to cure people in general. Like he's that kind of scientist where he's splicing DNA, he's researching, he's trying to find cures to ailments, diseases, and he's experimenting with spider DNA and ends up giving himself superhuman powers. So it's kind of weird though, because he takes that to say, okay, well, I'm going to build a super suit and I'm going to go fight people, versus, hey, I've discovered this awesome thing that has given me these powers. Maybe I should reverse engineer what I did so that I can help other people. But he kind of ditches the scientist thing and goes for the superhero thing, which works for the story, but seems kind of strange.
Well, and he comes off as kind of emotionally cold, because you can see that his relationship with Kaori is kind of broken down through the years, and she blames him for not doing enough to save her sister Hannah from a disease. I don't remember what the disease was, or even if it was defined. But it gets weirder than him injecting himself with DNA and building a giant mecha suit, because Kaori's sister Hannah has somehow contacted like an interdimensional entity while she's in a coma, and that entity, I think it was called like Namura or something, comes out and is kidnapping people and turning them into cyborgs. I have no idea what's going on or why Namura wanted to do that. But that's the villain that Aaron Eichman was fighting in this story. I mean, it worked if they were going for sort of an homage to especially Masamune's work in manga. I do know that something that has been that I'm not sure if he went on record or one of the makers of the movie went on record as saying, was that things don't have to make sense in an anime story or a manga story as long as they look cool. And this issue 3 of Edge of the Spider-Verse, is kind of the epitome of that. Everything looks super cool, but at a certain point in the story, I was just like, what is going on? I mean, it's so crazy. So I mean, I can't say that I didn't enjoy it, because it was fun to sort of track. And I don't know if they were trying to homage, if only very lightly, the sort of early battles of Iron Man versus supernatural villains, because Iron Man used to fight the Mandarin a whole lot, who has supernatural powers, and that was kind of their shtick, was the science versus magic. So it kind of has the vibe of that, but I never really understood why the comatose sister was contacting this other thing, or how that came about exactly.
I think she was just in such a deep coma that she somehow touched, I think they call it like the doorway between worlds, where she kind of stumbled upon this thing in her deep coma. And since the inheritors were out there looking for spider entities, somehow her connection to Dr. Eichman allowed them to step through that doorway and use her to get to him. I guess that's the take that they're going with. This one was interesting too, because this was the same writer and the same artist. So I don't know if it's one of those where, you're focusing on the art and story together, that sometimes you lose track of the story that you're telling because you're trying to make it look pretty at the same time, or, what sort of happened in here. But it seems like we crammed a lot of different things happening. We didn't really explain all of them, just to kind of tell a story and then have him be killed off at the end. It just seemed like such a brief moment of this character that it really gave me that feeling of like, you're looking through a portal and you just see another character, and here's our regularly scheduled program already in progress. And you just see this flash of this character, and then he gets killed off, and then that's it. Like there wasn't really any intent to develop him any more than this, other than to tell a quick story and then end him.
No, and even within this miniseries, which I mean, I don't know if I would describe this miniseries as filler so much as just sort of a, hey, we're going to set up some of the characters that are going to be important in Spider-Verse. This issue was filler, because it was just like, well, if they're going to kill him off at the end, what purpose did he serve in the overall narrative that they're trying to tell? And I mean, maybe the only thing I could dig into that and think maybe was contributing to it was they did need to show that Morlan and his inheritors were capable of killing some of the Spider-Men and taking their powers or feeding on their powers. And I guess that establishes them as a credible threat to our Spider-Man. Yeah, it was just kind of a weird aside.
I would agree with you, except the next issue that we can get into, unless there's anything else on issue 3, that really felt like a one shot filler issue to round this out and also tell a really terrible story and end it. The whole Dr. Eichman thing, it seemed interesting. It seemed like there could be a lot more to it. It just didn't take off, and it's kind of sad that there's not more to it. But this next one, I'm very glad that it ended when it did, and I hope we never see this character again.
Yeah. So Patton Parnell is the Spider-Man or the Spider Monster that we meet in issue 4. And as Joe mentioned, this is his only appearance, at least that I'm aware of in comics. And he was kind of a monster before he got superpowers. So this was an attempt to transplant the Spider-Man idea and put it into a straight up horror setting with all of the tropes of that genre. And whereas Spider-Man Noir was very successful at taking the Spider-Man idea and adapting it to a different genre, I think this one failed pretty spectacularly.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think this one is very notable because the writer credited on here is actually a horror novelist, and he does have a lot of Marvel credits, but I think that him being a horror novelist primarily really gives you all you really need to know about this issue, and it translates really well, but it's also very horrific, and I'm glad that that's all there is of it.
Well, I mean, so there's something when discussing the horror genre that there are basically 2 ways to look at characters in this genre, especially in like slasher movies, but also in horror in general. You can do one of 2 things. You can either have a character that's completely unlikable so that your audience is rooting for when he gets it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that especially the slasher movies do a lot. There's always that dumb jock or that, edgy kid from school that you're just like, oh, I wish he would shut up and stop bullying everybody. And then finally, when he gets killed in the movie, you're cheering. Or there's the other side of the coin where you're like, well, let's really develop this person and make the audience care about them so that there's some pathos whenever we kill them off later. I would tend to prefer the latter, but I don't think this is successful. So just to, spoil the story ahead of time, Patton Parker is a massive jerk right out the gate. He is not somebody that's likable. It's even implied that he might be some kind of like a serial killer, or at the very least a sexual predator
eventually
in the making.
If he grew up.
Yeah, because he's like spying on Mary Jane through the window. He's doing this weird creepy narration to himself where he's like, the subject is dressing in her bedroom, and stuff like that. And it's just like, whoa, I feel like they leaned way too hard into that for us to really feel anything for him at all. Because from the first 2 or 3 pages that we met Patton's like, man, either this guy's going to have a heck of a character arc and go through a huge change, or maybe he's going to join the bad guys in the Spider-Verse event. I don't know, but I am not with him. I don't know.
Well, and they call him Splattin' Patton, which I guess because I don't know, does he squish the spiders? Is that why they call him that? Or
he experiments on animals like for fun, which another thing that you'll see said in the media and various other places is that people can usually forgive you if you accidentally kill somebody with your car or something like that, but you do something to an animal and you're done in Hollywood forever. So this is this is just like he's experimenting on defenseless animals just for kicks. And I think they go to a museum and see a rare spider at one point, and he's Mary Jane is sort of an activist, an animal rights activist, so she's like, oh, we're going to free all these animals. And he goes right for the rare spider and is like, oh, I could do weird crap with this, and then of course it bites him, and that's how the story proceeds. But yeah, I don't know. He was a pretty hard sell as a person for me. I never felt like I cared about what happened to him.
Well, there
You
was
know?
one moment kind of towards the end where Sarah Jane, I don't know, like he started to sort of win her over a little bit, and she seemed to give him some attention, and it was that Mary Jane trope of like in the Raimi movies where she's attracted to the jock with the fancy car and all this stuff, and then she starts to fall for the simple nerd character. So there was a little bit of that in there, and I think for a brief moment I started to feel that again, and I was like, ah, and then yeah. And then the story happened, and then I was like, okay, good, this is gross, let's get this over with. So
Yeah, and then he turns into a giant spider monster that's like, goring people and stuff.
yeah.
I did have a logistical question about the spider monster. He only has 4 arms and 2 legs, and I don't know why I focused on that, but it bugged me because shouldn't he have 6 arms and 2 legs if he's a spider?
That's
yeah,
funny.
it did. It bugged me. Hey, man, spiders are arachnids, not bugs.
Oh yeah.
Don't you know anything about science?
It was still punny. Well,
It was funny.
I'm no Dr. Eichman, but I know.
Yeah, well, no, you're not. Yeah, so I don't know. This horror thing was just it. I think they could have made it work if they had given us a more likable protagonist, and even if they had driven it a little bit more into like Hulk territory, because the Hulk is a monster and he goes out of control, but we root for him because he goes on a rampage. I don't want to say in the name of justice exactly, but he goes on a rampage that ends up smashing bad guys and things of that nature. And I think there was room for them to take an angle where us as an audience would have been a little bit more behind him. But what we have here is him basically just going from I'm prepping for my future career as a serial killer to, oh, I've turned into a monster. Now I can do it better.
Yeah.
And he dies at the end of the story.
And now all of the neighborhood cats are missing because he's feeding on them.
gosh.
And then he literally has a bird webbed up in his locker for a snack.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. So it's one of those. It's funny. It's funny just to think about, like, what was the writer thinking when he wrote this? And I guess he does hit a lot of sort of horror genre touchstones, but just for whatever reason, this genre didn't fit, or maybe this writer didn't quite have the right angle to attack it from. I don't know. I think there was a way to make that concept work. I just don't think that this writer pulled it off at all. So, another critique I have is that the art in it, there's this really stylized sort of like 1940s horror movie poster that they did for the cover art that fit this story to a T, in my opinion. If they had the penciler that did the cover art do the whole issue, I think it would have been a lot better. Maybe not narratively, but it just visually it would have been a lot better.
Yeah.
But what we get is just a standard comic book look. It's not really stylized in any way. It's just stock comic book art. And I don't know. It just didn't work for me. It didn't help the story. It didn't really hinder the story, but it didn't really help it either.
Yeah.
And I think when juxtaposed with the way the cover looked, that kind of highlighted to me more like, oh wow, they really could have taken this another direction. So
yeah, I didn't think about that. Like, I'm looking at the cover art again, and it would have been a lot better, I think, and a lot more horrific, because what they show us is like, it's pretty gross, but the spider creature that only has 4 arms at the end kind of looks more like a spider demon than an actual like serial killer kid who's transforming into a spider. It's
right.
It's just, I don't know, weird. But I did want to say, from the writer's website, Clay McLeod Chapman, there is a quote from Time Out New York that says, Chapman is a horror drunk storytelling virtuoso master idiot. And I think that helps put this into perspective.
I hope that's self-proclaimed.
Well, it's on his website, so hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully so. Yeah, well, so anyway, Spider Monster was a pretty big miss, I guess, for both of us.
Yeah.
So onwards to Penny Parker.
Yeah. So last but not least.
Yeah, definitely not least.
So she's like the alternate universe version of Peter Parker, but from Japan. But she is also very quite different in origin from Peter Parker, or really anything else that we've encountered up until this point. So she's actually teaming up with this radioactive spider. So the spider itself has a role to play, and it's sort of like almost like a symbiosis thing, but they control a giant mechanical suit, which is inspired from the suits that are in Neon Genesis Evangelion. So the suit's incredibly powerful, and it's really like a manga suit where basically anything that you need it to do, it can do that based on the situation. And that has more to do with the art and writing style, I think, than the actual suit itself. But this character, she actually has gone on to appear in Amazing Spider-Man miniseries called Web Warriors, Spider-Verse itself, and also the later Spider-Verse related title Spider-Geddon. And then she also has a cameo in an issue of Spider-Gwen as well. So this is a character.
Oh, wow. So she's shown up a lot.
Yeah, we've actually done something with.
Oh, and another quick note. You did mention Gerard Way earlier. Yes, that is the lead singer of My Chemical Romance. He has written comic books before and after this. So I think he's most famous for being the writer behind Umbrella Academy, which has had 2 seasons on Netflix. So that's been a pretty successful property at Dark Horse. And he also had an imprint at DC Comics where he brought back Doom Patrol, which was a series that had really been out of publication for a long time. And they've now had like 3 seasons of a show on HBO Max. So his properties tend to be pretty successful. And as weird as it is, yes, he is from that kind of pop rock music scene and has moved from that into being a comic book writer. Mm-hmm. So I really, really enjoyed this one. And I don't know if it's just when I was in high school growing up watching a lot of anime, especially the Gundam series, that's probably the closest thing that I've seen to this, where it's all about the mecha and getting in these giant suits. And, you know, they don't fight monsters in that. I guess this is actually closer to Pacific Rim because she fights giant, I mean, literal giant monsters like you would see in old Japanese monster movies and stuff. So it's a giant robot versus kaiju story, you know, like Pacific Rim. But she does have kind of a symbiosis with the spider where they communicate back and forth somewhat, don't they?
Yeah.
That was kind of a cool concept. The art is super duper stylized. It's kind of in that vein of what I was describing with the Eichman story, except they blew it up to be way more stylized, way more over the top. I mean, the giant robot is like, you know, it looks like it's the size of a city block with these huge shoulder pads and gauntlets and everything. And she's sort of this cute schoolgirl that gets in that and goes and protects the city. So it's very much in line with a lot of anime tropes. I don't know. There's a couple of genres of anime that I would say it kind of combines, because there's sort of the magical girl thing where you're the chosen girl that's supposed to save everybody. And I think Sailor Moon is probably one of the most notable examples of that. But then there's also the mecha anime, which is a whole genre of, you know, just giant robot things. Gundam probably being the most well-known. I thought they could have pushed the art and made it a little bit even more anime, because that was something they did in the Spider-Verse movie that I thought worked super well, where they showed Penny and she was just straight up a completely different animation style than everybody else. She's like, yes, I am an anime character. And that I thought them owning that was cool. The faces and expressions on people in this comic were not as it wasn't where the artist spent his calories, really. It was really on the robot designs, the monster designs, all of those things. And but all of those things look super cool. And honestly, this was just a lot of fun. I mean, it's such a different take to see her within a different culture, but also using all this advanced technology and just, again, this was transplanting the Spider-Man concept into a completely different genre. And I felt like it really worked. So,
well, and that's the fun thing about the Spider-Verse too, is, you know, you're not just seeing Peter Parker and he's slightly different, although there are some of those variants out there, but there's a lot of them that are just so completely different from the Peter Parker that we know and that we're used to, and the way that they acquire their spider powers or the way that they use them. to fight crime is just so different, and it's interesting to see how they operate and what they're about, what they do.
Yeah, and I would imagine this was a really fun writing exercise for everybody involved too, where it's like I don't know if editorial handed out specific assignments where they're like, okay, you're going to write a horror Spider-Man, you're going to write a film noir Spider-Man, you're going to write a manga Spider-Man. I don't know if it came from that or if the writers were just given kind of free reign to, like, hey, create a, use the Spider-Man mythology and create a new character. But the ones where they're having fun, you can really tell that they're having fun. And I think the three that clearly had the most staying power were Spider-Man Noir, Spider-Gwen, and Penny Parker. So I'm glad that those characters went on to exist in some form after this.
Yeah.
So last week, I was having a little bit of difficulty landing on a rating and, finally made a decision with this one. There was never really any question where I was going to land. And I'm going to preface this by saying the rating I'm giving this is because we're rating this as a complete work, not the individual issues. There were some individual issues in here that were 4s out of 5s. There was a 1 or a 2 out of 5, a few 3s. It was kind of all over the place, but I think because the reading experience is so uneven and the quality varies so drastically between issues, I don't think I can give it higher than a 3. So I'm pretty sure that's where I'm going to land on this. If you're reading it as a trade and you're interested in getting into these characters, I think it's a fitting introduction to them. Again, for whatever reason, Penny and Spider-Man Noir landed with me a little bit more than Spider-Gwen, but I'll definitely agree that Spider-Gwen had a lot of potential. It left me with the most questions and the most like, oh, I need to read more to continue this story. So it's going to be 3 bananas out of 5 for me.
All right. Well, I'm going to give it 1 additional banana, and my rating will be a 4 out of 5. And despite a lot of the issues that you had with the issues, from my perspective, I looked at this as more of like a teaser. And it's a nice way to sort of get your feet wet into, wait, there are other Spider-Man type characters out there. What are they? And it's like a sampler platter of, you get to sample different flavors and different tastes of Spider-Man, or now Spider-Woman or women or Spider-Girl or whatever you want to call them, but characters with spider related powers. You get to see a little bit, peek into their world, kind of see what's going on, get a little bit of a story to get your feet wet, and then from here you can say, you know what, I want to read more about that Spider-Man Noir, or I want to see more about Gwen Stacy, or I want to see more horrific spider stuff from Parnell Patton, said no one ever. but I like the collection of just very different spider related characters, and if you didn't know about the Spider-Verse aspect, then this would really just be, I guess, like a collection of short stories that are completely unrelated. So if I were to complain about this at all, I would just say that I wish there was something that would either tie them together or something that would keep them separate. Like, instead of making this Edge of Spider-Verse, just make it Spider-Verse Portal or something, where you get to see these character stories and then they kind of just end. And then if you want to read more, you can go read more. But it gives all these different writers a chance to have their own take, and then if they take off and they get popular, then they can certainly do something with them from there. But it's still interesting to see. Like, we joked about the horror version with the killer spider, but it was still neat. It was something different, it was unique, and it was a unique writer that was brought in for it.
And if you, I will say this about it, and maybe maybe I'm being a little bit harsh, because the way I'm thinking of it is as a trade, as opposed to thinking of it as like, this is a sampler platter. It definitely is a sampler platter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I'm going to change my rating, but I will say that if you encounter a story in here that you're like, man, this one just really doesn't connect with me, it's only 24 pages, and then you're going to be to something completely different.
Right.
So that is kind of the strength and the weakness of it, where it's like, if you were really vibing with whatever was going on, well, you're only going to get 1 issue. But if you didn't care for it, then hey, the good news is you're only going to get 1 issue. So it kind of works in both directions that way, where you're just onward to the next thing. And it was a very, very quick read too.
Yeah, that was the other thing is I wish they had featured some additional characters in here. Like we got to see one-off issues of various characters that maybe we didn't get to see as much of in the Spider-Verse event, or that we had only heard mentioned, and we would get to see a little bit more. Like take these characters that got killed right away and do something fun with them, or have like a one-shot story where they get to do something else besides, get killed. If you want to read more about the Spider-Verse itself, there's obviously a trade that has all of the Spider-Verse issues, but then you can also read Superior Spider-Man, Secret Wars, Web Warriors. The Intro to Spider-Verse movie from 2018 that we mentioned is really good. The Ultimate Spider-Man animated series has an episode called The Spider-Verse where they feature some of these characters. And then there's also some very different takes on the Spider-Verse concept, actually, that came before. So I guess the Spider-Verse is different takes on these things. But anyway, Spider-Man, the animated series that we mentioned earlier, and then also a video game from 2010 called Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, which was actually written by Dan Slott. So it's sort of like the inspiration for the Spider-Verse storyline. So just if you want to do some more reading, you like this stuff, that's where you can go to get more.
Yeah, all right.
So next time on We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones, we are going to get into the origin of Spider-Woman, and this is Spider-Woman Jessica Drew. This is an origin story from 2007. So it'd be interesting to delve more into that next time.
And I will say that I'm excited to get into that because I like Jessica Drew, and I have read her as a member of the Avengers, but I have not read her as a solo hero. So that will be something really cool for me to see for the first time, and that will round out our spider-related trilogy.
Excellent.
So until next time, everybody, thank you so much for listening, and check us out on Spotify and everywhere else.
Thank you very much for listening.
Comic books, comics,
Comic book podcast. Comics.
Because they have no bones.
Peace out.